Welcome to Yes Witch, your pod spellcast for all things metaphysical, witchy, and weird. I'm your host, Whitney Wickham. This week we're discussing resurrection and necromancy. Let's dive into it, shall we? Now, I have to admit, this week's podcast is probably going to be a bit shorter, even still, from the ones in the past few weeks, just because, again, we're on quarantine. Man, this whole thing is just bonkers. Just bonkers. I won't get into the details about how crazy things are because we're all living this reality together. Some people's reality is a little bit better than others. For those of you that are struggling, I send you my deepest sympathies and all the best energy that I possibly can. Please check on your friends and your family. This is a very difficult time for many. And so I just want to reiterate that means that things around here are a little bit odd too. I've got my entire family here on a consistent basis. We're really not leaving the house. So if you hear any sounds in the background, children laughing, perhaps crying, maybe things breaking, that just means that they are making memories and I'm out here safe in the garage recording this for you. So today's subject, we are discussing resurrection and necromancy. The thing about resurrection that I find interesting is that there are so many stories about resurrection across history, across theologies and belief systems, and it always seems to come from almost like a hero journey situation where you've got this person who is revered above and beyond human form, that they are sort of this divine entity in a human body, and then they give themselves up, realistically, sort of a sacrifice, and then they come back, and humanity is, like, saved. So most of us in the Western culture recognize the story of Jesus Christ. Springtime often reminds us of this story simply because of Easter. But there is a side to this that goes further than Christianity. I mean, we're talking about different belief systems that have been around since before Christianity. The pagans have these stories as well. And paganism, to be clear, isn't one particular belief system. If you are not part of a belief system that sprung off from Judaism, that includes Islam, that includes Christianity, if you're not part of these Abrahamic religions, as they call them, then you would be considered pagan or something else. There's hundreds of thousands of different belief systems out there, and I personally am Kemetic. That means that I follow the Egyptian belief system, and that's who I am. So I am a pagan Kemetic witch. That's kind of how I identify, and there's hundreds of thousands of people across the world that believe different belief systems than that of Christianity, but yet we share a lot of these same stories, which I find very fascinating. So first, before we dive really deep into this whole thought process, I want to make a friendly reminder that I am looking for people to join on my podcast as guests. So if you or somebody you know is knowledgeable about things that are metaphysical, witchy, or bizarre, please have them contact me through my website or my social medias that you can find at www.yes-witch.com. I would love to speak with you further about having you on as a telephoned-in guest so we can discuss interesting concepts together and begin to expand our horizons more than just my own personal thought on my own pieces of paper that I come with every single week, because my thoughts are cool, but let's be honest, it's always great to have other people chime in. There are many people out there who are far more educated than I, and I would love to hear from you. So please contact me and let's get some conversations going. So my tool of the week, I always start off with the tool of the week. My tool of the week is sun tea, also known as iced tea. I mean, a lot of people create iced tea by putting just a tea bag in a jar of water or in a pitcher of water. They set it out and they let the sun do its thing. And I feel like this is a great time to start doing this because it allows us to create sun tea, not just tea made from, sitting it out there. There's a power to the sun. There's a revitalization that comes. I almost said reverberate. A revitalization that comes from the sun. The sun, like I said, in a lot of my writings, and I've talked about this before, the sun is that illuminating path, that wisdom that comes to us. It's that guiding light. And so by creating sun tea, we are able to harness the power of the sun and actually consume it into our bodies. And it can help us in not only a spiritual way, but a physical way. And water is always great, obviously, too. And tea is a great way to also, wake yourself up, perk yourself up throughout the day, but doesn't give you that really draggy feeling from coffee, for instance. Or you can make some coffee too, whatever it is that you want to make it, put it in a pitcher, put it in a jar, just some water, bag of tea, or even kids' Kool-Aid. Set it out there on the porch. Let the sun illuminate through it. Let it, soak into that water and do its thing, and then consume it with gratitude, knowing that the sun is there for us, for our vitality, for our growth. It helps the trees grow, the plants grow to help bring us oxygen. It helps us create vitamin D, which is important for our bodies to do our physical chemical reactions. Part of our metabolism is built off of creation of vitamin D. So what better way to just begin using the sun? Now, I'm not saying the vitamin D appears inside of whatever it is that we're creating. I'm just saying that there's a correlation there between the sun and our personal being. So of course there's a spiritual connection as well. In no means does creating sun tea allow you to soak in vitamin D. You have to physically be outside soaking in the sun's rays in order for your body to create vitamin D. Let me be very clear. Last thing I need is somebody writing me and saying, hey, you don't know what you're talking about. I do have a degree in nutrition, so I do know what I'm talking about, but sometimes the things that come out of my mouth do not sound the way that I intend them to, so I always have to backtrack and be like, wait, hold on, let me just rephrase that. Rewind, rephrase, there we go. So using the sun to create beverages of sorts, whatever it is that you decide to do, I'm just using iced tea as an example, is a great way to lift our spirits when we're having, this depressing time. I mean, it's not so great right now. Things are kind of crappy. So let's utilize the power of the sun, create something great for ourselves, really sit, enjoy drinking whatever it is that we've made, and just soak in our life force and be grateful. Again, I always go back to gratitude. When things are really just kind of out of control, I try to go back to gratitude as much as I possibly can. And I really have found, even though this was a struggle, to say the least, to get myself to that point where I'm able to, even in the face of adversity or the face of struggle, to really say, you know what, I am grateful. I am grateful that this happened, because a lot of times when things happen that are difficult, our first thing to go is, oh, I can't believe this is happening right now. And we start to focus on the negative. So drink your tea, take your time, give your gratitudes, and just don't be afraid to sit in silence. Now is the time for introspection. Now is the time to really look into ourselves and say, what are some things that I want to change? What are some things that I need to work on? I know a lot of other witches out there are doing shadow work right now. It's not a bad time to do that. There's a lot of great processes that can occur in this time of, just silence. And most of us don't like to sit in silence with ourselves because it means that we have to listen. Then when things start to come up, when we sit in silence, it's like, first everything's just quiet and you're like, okay, I'm bored. But then things start to bubble up and you realize that there's things that you haven't dealt with and you have to start dealing with those things. And so a lot of people that I know have been writing me going, I just feel crazy right now. I feel like I don't know what to do with myself. And I'm going, sometimes sitting in silence is the best teacher, because that's where we can start to do the most work on ourselves and for ourselves. So don't be afraid to sit in silence, drink your tea, and enjoy the time. That being said, last week we talked about the moon. We talked about that balance. And so again, drinking something that has to do with the sun, getting that balance between sun and moon is so, so important as we begin this process of working on ourselves, bettering ourselves, and moving forward in our spirituality. So let's talk about resurrection first. It's starting to get close to Easter. We just had Ostara for those who are of Wiccan or belief systems that celebrate something similar to Ostara. Easter is an interesting thing for me. I grew up in a Christian household, so I still celebrate Easter. I celebrate it with my kids. My husband is Catholic, so he, of course, celebrates Easter. And so we've kind of learned to just sort of combine this entire season as one sort of mass entity. But what's interesting about resurrection in the spring is that it really isn't just the Christian belief system that believes in resurrection. There are so many beliefs that talk about resurrection, and they utilize the spring as an homage to that sort of metaphor. So with the Wiccan and pagan celebrations of Ostara, they use a lot of the same symbology that we see in the so-called Christian Easter. A lot of those symbols have actually been taken from pagan belief systems. Whether or not you believe what I'm saying is totally up to you, but I mean, take the time to research it. The Christian cross comes from the Ankh. There's been links to that in historical musings and scholarly sources there. There's also connections with eggs and, of course, the bunny. So resurrection also ties to fertility. Who would have thought? Springtime is such a fertile time. And when we say fertile, it's not just fertile in the sense of like having babies and sexuality. It's actually also a time for birthing new ideas. This is a new beginning. It's a beginning of the new year. In reality, a lot of belief systems started the new year kind of in the springtime or right after springtime, and they allowed the year to stretch from that time because it was a more obvious progression of how things grow and shift. So going from a position of being very young and fertile to sort of growing into your adulthood and your peaking, in summer, and then harvesting the fruits of your labor in the fall, and then finally dying off in the winter to once again resurrect in the spring. So the regrowth of life after death in winter is also tied into this, is that the spring is sort of the celebration of seeing new growth. We're seeing the death and decay actually be utilized by the earth itself to sort of foster the relationship of growing new things. New flowers are in bloom, trees are sprouting, we've got our crops that we're beginning to plant so that we can harvest it later, knowing that this is the general process that we dive into, is that we have to plant to work through the summer, work on ensuring that we are able to harvest the fruits and vegetables and whatever it is that we're growing in order to have that in the fall and preparation for a long winter. The lengthening of the sun's rays up through summer are that guiding light and illumination of growth until that harvest. So again, we see the sun longing its days for us, giving us more time to work, giving us more time, more illumination, more brightness, more vitality than in the rest of the year, because it is there for us to continue working and pushing forward until that time in which we are then going to decay, if you will, in the fall through the winter. The motif and dying of the re-rising deity is not only synonymous with the Christian belief system, as I said before. It's a story that goes past the ages, and it reflects itself in many, many different world traditions. And this motif is beautifully explained in the writings of James Frazer's The Golden Bough. He, like many other people who have used symbology, he chooses symbols that go across belief systems, and they tie in with fertility rites. So again, springtime is tied into fertility. It's not just about regrowth and rebirth and resurrection, it's about fertility. So he cites examples in Tammuz, Adonis and Attis, Dionysus, Jesus, and my boy Osiris. He uses symbology and metaphor throughout his entire writing to describe this cycle of death and resurrection, fertility, working through that fertility and then death and resurrection. So it's a very interesting, if you get a chance, take a look at that. Again, it's James Frazier's The Golden Bough. It is from the 1800s, so of course there's going to be language in there that might be a little bit more of the, hey, let me look up the spark notes on this, and that's perfectly fine, but it's just an interesting way to look at it. Another thing that you can always look into is also hero's journey. This cyclical motion of how stories are written ties into the same ideology of, you've got this, let's use Jesus as an example. You've got this guy named Jesus who sets off to do great things, and the reason why he sets off to do great things in his life is because there's a catalyst of some kind. I mean, he goes to the temple to pray, and he finds out that he's, God incarnate, and then he meets people along the way throughout his life that help him on his quest to enlighten the folks of humanity about what path we should be following, etc., until he finally meets his climax where he is crucified on the cross and then voila, resurrects 3 days later. So again, this cyclical motion, very much a hero's journey, very much this idea of death and rebirth, death and rebirth. So we see spring shown in fertility with symbols of rabbits as well, who reproduce extremely quickly. They say, they are blanking like rabbits. Need we say more? Eggs also symbolize fertility, and we use eggshells in witchcraft often for protection. We create cascarilla for writing all sorts of different protective sigils. We use it in place of salt, etc. There are many different uses for eggshells, and eggshells are a form of fertility. Flowers, again, we've got this idea of things being in bloom, opening. When I look at a flower, I look at the potential growth and how something is opening to the world and becoming its most beautiful self in that moment. The second that flower begins to open, it's like coming to its full potential more than anything. And it's a rebirth and blooming also into sexual maturity, because we have, pollination, and without that pollination process, we don't get certain fruits and certain vegetables, etc. So I find this to be very interesting. It's something to dive more into and to begin to really study the ties between different religions and mythologies on how death and resurrection and fertility all tie in together. We're really not all that different when you really think about it. It's like the stories and the main themes really have very similar thought processes and similar paths in their story. It's just a matter of whether or not the names, dates, and locations have changed. I sort of feel like sometimes when a story is told from a different belief system, I'm like, the names, the dates, and the stories in regard to this have been changed for the protection of the people involved. That's sort of how I feel that this comes across, but it really is very much similar, which is why I, in all honesty, went and chose the path of being a witch over what I had been doing. I used to work for a church, and I have no shame in saying that, and I still am very fond of the people that I work with. My reason behind changing back to witchcraft more than anything was because I felt like it was more encompassing of the idea that we all really truly celebrate the exact same thing. It's just a matter of whether or not we are understanding the translation to one another. It's like the stories are all the same, and we're fighting over the same thing. It's like, there's a God. Yes, we know there's a God. Like, and not everybody believes that there is a God that is a witch. So if by any means, if you're one of those people out there that is more in tune with nature or whatever, that is perfectly fine. I have no hate for you in any way, shape, or form. But for those of you that use deities in your craft, I mean, I think we can all agree that a lot of these stories are very much the same. I mean, like, I look at Dionysus and I'm like, you are so in line with my boy Osiris. It's like not even funny. So I have really nothing negative to say about anybody's personal belief system. And I hope that diving more into this particular form of study, talking about the differences in different theologies and belief systems about resurrection and rebirth and regrowth, sort of will illuminate that more for other people out there. I would love to hear things that you come across if you find some sort of resource in your studies that either goes against or proves what I'm talking about today, I would love to read it. So send it my way, message me on my social media, or send me an email at yeswitchbiz@gmail.com. Welcome back. We are now talking about necromancy. What is necromancy? Necromancy is really the practice of speaking to the dead for the purpose of divination, more than anything. I know that there are so many people right now that are cringing at this thought. How evil it is to use divination, number one, and number two, how evil it is to begin speaking to spirits. Now, I'm not going to lie, I've had my own fair share of creepy things that have happened doing this, so I'm not really big on the whole, I'm going to use my powers of necromancy, I'm going to talk to the dead kind of thing. I definitely have a very open third eye, and the last thing that I enjoy is doing something in my everyday life to all of a sudden have some spirit show up. I'm like, whoa, you need to back it up. Give me some fair warning, because when you just right there in my face trying to have a conversation with me, I'm not about that. Put a bell around your neck so I know you're coming. Something. I don't know. It's just a little bit too nerve-wracking for me. I've had that happen more times than I would like to admit. So I know in my personal work, I need to be working on how to open and close my third eye in ways that allow me to sort of filter what comes in and what comes out. But some ways that other people are using necromancy would be a spirit or a Ouija board. I've used spirit and Ouija boards before. It was really when I was just starting to kind of dabble in witchcraft, and I can say that my experiences were not exactly the most positive. I know plenty of people who work with these on a day-to-day basis and never have an issue, but for me, it was something that was really kind of off the wall and very frightening. I'm sure a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was 15 years old and didn't know what the hell I was doing. But it just sort of seemed like it opened up portals that I wasn't, capable of controlling, and that it really put me in a dangerous position. I just remember the first time that I ever used a Ouija board. I was at a friend's house, and we were goofing off and we were having a good time, and her house was notoriously haunted, as it was anyway. And I just remember we were sitting there with both of our fingers on the eyepiece, and the pieces moving around the board, and we're like, ooh, this is so spooky, how scary. And then all of a sudden it was like things just shifted. The room became heavy and very foreboding. We both had this feeling of danger. The hairs on the back of our necks stood up. We both got like goosebumps all over our arms, and we both just looked at each other. We were like, we need to stop. And it was immediately in that second that the windows in her room started going up and down. These were heavy windows. She lived in a Victorian home, and so these were made out of solid wood, and it took a lot to push these windows up. And so to see these windows go up and down so fast with rapid motion where nobody was standing next to it, it was just terrifying. So I remember lifting my hands off the eyepiece, and as I did that, it was like the eyepiece levitated in the air, and then as I lifted my hands, it was like the eyepiece just shot across the room. And I remember looking at my friend, and I was like, we're done. We are done here. And I remember flipping the board and flipping the eyepiece, and then it was like from that moment on, her room was never the same. And again, being 15 years old, not really knowing what we were doing, how to open things, how to close things, we definitely left ourselves vulnerable. So necromancy is not something for the faint of heart. It's not something that you should just pick up and try for the fun of it. I mean, I would definitely do your research, as always, and more often than not, try to find somebody that's extremely versed in what they're doing if it's something that you would like to learn. Another form of necromancy that you can use is a pendulum. I do use pendulums, but I usually use my pendulums to communicate with my spirit guides more than anything. Now, here's the funny thing that I would like to preface, because we have so many naysayers out there saying necromancy is evil, don't do it. Here's the thing. Once again, necromancy is the practice of speaking to the dead for the purpose of divination. Okay, that's the true definition. You can look it up on the internet. That's the definition. If your deity died and you are speaking to that deity and you are receiving a message back, whether it's through prayer or any other form of communication, you are using necromancy. Doesn't matter if it's a prayer. If that deity has died and you are speaking to them, receiving messages from them, oh Lord, please show me what is my path, and they are giving you an answer back, you are using the power of necromancy. Sorry, hate to be the one to burst that bubble, but that is 100% the truth. And what I'm going to start doing on this podcast is I'm going to start being a little bit more brass about some of these things, because I find it very frustrating to be in a belief system that is so constantly demeaned. And we go through a lot of so I'm going to start doing something on my podcast that I kind of was shying away from before. I tried to keep things very, very positive, and I'm going to still do that. It's just that we're in a belief system where we are consistently discriminated against. I mean, we are not the majority. We are not the loudest voice out there. And so a lot of people are out there talking about beliefs that they don't even truly understand themselves. And so when we look at the quote unquote rules of the more secular belief systems, they're telling us not to do certain things, but then they themselves are doing the same thing. And so I'm going to start being a little bit more open about these types of things, because I think it's important to share these facts, that it's like one hand washes the other, so we shouldn't be held to the standard of don't do this, don't do that, when in fact they are actually being instructed to use whatever that is, and in this case it's necromancy, to communicate with their deity, because it's really no different than some of the things that we ourselves are doing. Because I don't use my pendulums to communicate with any random person. I'm using my pendulums specifically to speak to my spirit guides and nothing more than that. Another way that you can use necromancy is through seances. Personally, I have never been to a seance, nor do I ever plan on being at one. There are some things that I'm just like, that is too far that way for me. If you're about that, cool. I would love to hear if you've ever had an experience being at a seance. Ouija board usage is not the same as a seance. I can tell you that. They might use those tools, but that does not mean that you are doing a seance when you are using a Ouija board. It really is a rite that you are doing. There's methodology that goes into running a seance or being part of a seance, and I have yet to be part of that. So I prefer to not dive into that deep end unless it becomes necessary at some point. Who knows? Maybe as my path goes, maybe I find somebody that I'm like, hey, you know what? You seem like a cool cat. Let's go ahead and do this. But for the time being, I'm perfectly happy just using my pendulum and sticking to myself in my own little safe space of what it is that I feel comfortable practicing, and we're good there. Anything beyond that, I'm like, I don't know. Those waters are a little deep and dark, and I don't know where my toes are hanging. So there's many different ways to use necromancy. And in all honesty, if you are getting communication from somebody on the other side, whether you're using mediumship of some kind or your third eye just happens to be open at that moment, necromancy isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like I said, if your deity has died and you are communicating with them and you're getting messages back from the other side, you are using necromancy. And so this whole idea that, I don't know, when I think of the word necromancer, I think of the terrible thing from Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, oh my god, that's so scary. I hate that. It's so terrifying. And it's true, the necromancer is scary. He's so scary. But we have this really negative view of necromancy that it doesn't need to be that way. When I meditate and I communicate with my spirit guides, I feel this sense of relief and excitement and joy, because I know that they're hearing me, and I know that I am doing what I need to do to move forward in my life in the best way that I possibly can. So I urge each of you to take a different view, look at things from a different point of view. I'm not saying go out and buy a Ouija board. I'm not saying use pendulums. I'm not saying be part of a seance or any other form of necromancy that you can find. But what I am saying is to open your mind a little bit and understand that not everything is as deep and dark and scary as we think it is. I tell you what, guys, I have had so much fun running this podcast. I hope you guys have started to enjoy what I am putting out there as well. And again, I'm learning. It's all new things, but I'm super excited to be doing this and being here with all of you, spreading the knowledge that I'm learning and also getting more information from all of you. You guys are a wealth of information, I don't know if you know how valuable that is to the world, but start sharing your voice. So if there's a subject that you'd like to discuss, or like I said, you want to be a guest on my podcast, by all means, feel free to write me on any of my social media and visit my webpage at www.yes-witch.com. Next week, we'll be talking about the power of spring. I look forward to it so very much. You all have an amazing and wonderful week. Stay safe, stay healthy.